All right, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. My name is Caitlin Rose. I'm the Executive Director of Columbus Veg Community. We are an all-volunteer-run 501c3 nonprofit, and our mission is to make learning about veganism and trying vegan foods as fun, friendly, and accessible as possible. Now, today's event is designed to build upon the event that we hosted on January 19th, at which Dr. Seth Josephson presented Interconnected Oppression, Linking Veganism with Other Struggles for Justice. Now, the lecture, or the recording of that lecture, as well as the slides for that presentation, are available to view on our YouTube. Following today's event, we have many more opportunities for learning, including an event in August. We are very excited to announce that the one and only Christopher Sebastian will be coming to Columbus to give a presentation on Saturday, August 22nd. So you can follow him online. His information is in our handout in the meantime, and be sure to save the date for that. Now, today's event and all of the events hosted by Columbus Veg Community is only possible because of the many dedicated, passionate activists that come together to form something so much greater than any one of us as individuals. So, you see many folks in CVC shirts here today that are participating in making sure this runs as smoothly as possible. And there are many more that can't be here with us today who have worked for the past several months to make this possible. Some of the folks who participate in Columbus Veg Community are business owners. Doshi Dough, Freely Vegan, Can't Believe It's Vegan, and Moonflower Bakery are all vegan businesses that are run by individuals who participate in and support Columbus Veg Community's grassroots efforts, including today's event. In addition to the familiar vegan faces that we have today, we also are thankful to have many comrades from the left here with us, one of whom is the wonderful Mary Minette, who I'm going to introduce you to in just a moment. Now, Mary is involved with many grassroots efforts here in Columbus and knows a lot about the organizations that we could get involved in that are working toward the kind of world that both vegans and leftists really want to see. So she's going to tell us a little bit more in a moment, but also in the program you can learn a lot more about those as well. Some logistical information. Of course, following today's lecture will be the opportunity for Q&A, and then there will be the raffle. Now, today's event, and every event, is also, as I mentioned, volunteer run, and it's also very dependent on the donations that we get from all of you. So if you've made a donation, thank you so much, and if in the future you can donate, even if it's $1 or $2, we really appreciate everything we can get. So again, our donation information is in here as well. We're also happy to show where every single one of your pennies goes into our programming. All right, thank you all so much for being here with us today. I'd now like to introduce you to Mary Minette.
Good morning, I guess it's still morning. Again, my name is Mary Minette, and I am a retired person who is an activist with several groups in Central Ohio and throughout the state. I really started working after the election in 2016 because I was a little panicked, as some of you might still be. And I hooked up with Indivisible, which was modeled on the Tea Party, but to help lobby our congressional representatives from the left. So we started working to let everyone know that we're active and we're here. For full information on Indivisible, there's some stuff in your program, but there are 3 basic Indivisibles in the Central Ohio area, and they're broken up by congressional districts. So there's 3, which is Central Columbus. There's 12, which is Clintonville and North and East. And then there's 15, which goes from Athens down to Wilmington in the southern part of Franklin County, Pickaway, Madison. Most of the Indivisible organizations are on Facebook, so if you're not on Facebook, well, I would encourage you just to look. And, you know, all of us don't like Facebook that much, but it is a good way to hook up with people who are active in the left. I'm also a member of Working America, which is funded by the AFL-CIO, so we work for union rights and for worker rights. I spent most of my life as a total introvert. This is really not me to be up here giving a talk. So I was, pretty much in my home, doing my thing, reading my books, watching my TV. But the election really got me going, and I forced myself to get out there. And I have met hundreds and hundreds of wonderful people who, a lot of people are also introverts. But when you gather together, just like we are today, you really meet so many cool people, and you find you have so much in common. We all need to work really hard together to change the world, and I believe deep in my heart we can do that. We can get things done. My background's in healthcare, so that's my big interest, but the environment, animal rights, all these things, we can do this if we work together. I left some voter registration forms on the front table. If you are not registered, if you have moved, if you want to check your registration, I can help you. But please, please, please vote. Every vote counts. I don't know if we've all heard these stories of elections that have been decided by one vote or a coin toss, but it happens all the time. We've got to vote. Your vote very much counts. The reason we're in this mess right now is that so many people didn't vote in 2016. So I would encourage you to step outside of your comfort zone a little bit, come to a rally. We have rallies all the time. We've had anti-war. We had one against Portman the other day. We really enjoy being with other people who feel the same way, and we can work together and change the world. So you can do that, but if you still feel like you can't get out there, you can do letters to the editor, you can do postcards, you can do letters to infrequent voters. There are all kinds of things that we can do from the comfort of our own home. So that's basically my background. I'm like scared to death half the time, so I get out there and make myself rally and talk to people and do activities. So it's now my pleasure to introduce Evan Thomas, who's the education director for the Columbus Veg Community. And he's a philosophy PhD candidate at the Ohio State University. Yeah. Evan's research focuses on the mental and moral status of non-human animals. So he has broad interests in ethics and political philosophy. In fact, he grew up in a left-leaning household. His parents met caucusing for Jesse Jackson. So Evan went vegan in 2013 after reading Animal Liberation by Peter Singer. When Evan isn't working or volunteering, he enjoys playing the piano for his wife and his feline companions. I know he's excited to share his presentation today with us. So without further ado, here's Evan.
Thank you, Mary, and thank all of you for being here today. I'm really flattered and excited to get to share my thoughts with you. So before I jump right in, I wanted to start by saying just a little bit about the motivation behind this talk. So I've always considered myself to be someone on the left, and in 2013, I went vegan. When I've thought about my commitment to leftist principles or my veganism, these things have always seemed to be very connected to me. I think I'm a leftist and I'm a vegan because I care about kindness, compassion, justice, equality. But one of the things that I found when I went vegan and I was moving around in these left-wing spaces is that there is a section of the left that is very critical of veganism and that even tries to present veganism as inconsistent with, or at least not part of, the left project. So what I want to do in the talk today is I want to look at those left-wing criticisms of veganism, and I'm going to argue that, well, they don't actually succeed in showing that we don't all have great reasons to embrace a philosophy of veganism. But I'm also going to argue that there are some important lessons that we can learn from those left-wing criticisms. So we should be listening to the left. They'll help us in the vegan movement have a more effective movement for justice. OK, so let's get started now. I want to start by talking a little bit about the tensions that exist between the left and veganism, but also the possibility for harmony. So when I first started doing the research for this presentation, what I did is I went online and I was like, left-wing criticisms of veganism. And I found a bunch of news articles published on recognizable left-wing news sites that were kind of bashing veganism. So here's a quotation from an article that was published in the Jacobin. The whole point of this article is to argue that animal rights, to put that on the same kind of playing field as other left-wing issues, is mistaken and, in fact, offensive. So here's a quotation from that article. No animals have ever struggled to gain better treatment in food production or to oppose unnecessary experimentation by cosmetic companies. I'm not sure about that, but insofar as animal rights exist, it is humans who have granted and fought for these rights. Animals themselves cannot be said to have inherent rights that we do not give them. So human social groups apparently fight for themselves, and this is why they have inherent rights. But animals don't fight for themselves, so they don't have inherent rights. Here's a quotation from an article that was published in the Socialist Worker. He kind of gets right to the point. He says, we need to insist on the essential differences between human beings and other animals and reject the idea of animal liberation. So apparently you can't be a socialist and believe that we should end the oppression and exploitation of animals. Here's a quotation from an article published in The Nation by Kate Aronoff, in which she's criticizing a recent book written by Jonathan Safran Foer, in which he argues that we should be adopting a vegan lifestyle in order to help fight climate change. So here's what Aronoff writes. She says, like so many well-intentioned liberals, Foer individuates a collective problem. Planetary salvation is possible only if we each, on our own, begin to become better people. So the image here of veganism is this image of a kind of hopelessly naive, moralizing project. All right, and finally, I've got just two articles here that I didn't pull quotations from, but the kind of titles give it away. So something published in Everyday Feminism, 4 Ways Mainstream Animal Rights Movements Are Oppressive. And here's an article that was published in Counterpunch. Animal Whites is the title of this article. So this is about white vegans and their racism. All right. Now, arguably, these tensions between the left and veganism go a long way back. So here's a quotation from Karl Marx. This is actually from the Communist Manifesto. So he says, a part of the bourgeoisie is desirous of redressing social grievances in order to secure the continued existence of bourgeois society. To this section belong members of societies for the prevention of cruelty to animals, temperance fanatics, and hole and corner reformers of every imaginable kind. So the basic idea here is that if you were really concerned about justice, you would be focusing all of your attention on abolishing capitalism. If you're worried about preventing cruelty to animals, that's just because you're trying to address some of the symptoms of capitalism to make sure that you can keep capitalist society in place. All right, so there are tensions, but there's also a long history of harmony between the left and veganism. So this is particularly true of the anarchist tradition. One way to think about anarchism is that it is a philosophical position that rejects all forms of oppressive hierarchies. Hierarchies where those on top benefit at the expense of those below. So it's not surprising that if that is your primary philosophical commitment, that you would also question the hierarchy that exists between humans and non-humans. So here's a quotation from one of the founding anarchist thinkers, Peter Kropotkin. He says approvingly, civilized man will extend his principles of solidarity to the whole human race and even to the animals. There are also some more recent leftists that have expressed support for animal rights and have argued that their commitment to animal rights is actually connected to their leftism. So here's a quotation from Cesar Chavez. Kindness and compassion toward all living things is a mark of civilized society. Racism, economic deprival, dogfighting and cockfighting, bullfighting, and rodeos are cut from the same fabric, violence. And Angela Davis is also a vegan and has spoken about her veganism in connection to our politics. So I'm going to let her speak for herself.
Yeah, I'm really interested in the work that you're doing around food because I think that that is one of the next major arenas of struggle. And I am sometimes really disappointed that that many of us can assume that we are these radical activists, but we don't know how to reflect on the food that we put in our own bodies. We don't realize the extent to which we are implicated in the whole process of capitalism by participating uncritically in the food politics offered us by the great corporations. And I usually don't mention that I'm vegan, but that has evolved, I think, and I think it's the right moment to talk about it because it is, I think, a part of a revolutionary perspective. How can we not only discover more compassionate relations with human beings, but how can we develop compassionate relations with the other creatures with whom we share this planet?
All right, so veganism, according to Angela Davis, is part of a revolutionary perspective. I couldn't have said it better myself. All right, so now I want to take a look at what the left is and also what veganism is so that we have a better sense of these two issues that we're talking about today. So I'm going to be speaking in generalities. Obviously, there's lots of different types of people that call themselves leftists, and leftists disagree about a lot of things. But in general, the left is critical of capitalism, anti-racist, feminist, pro-LGBTQ+, anti-ableist, and they're internationalist as opposed to nationalist. So leftists are concerned about people all over the world as opposed to just caring about the well-being of people in our own nation. So a question that we might ask at this point is, what is it that connects all these commitments of the left? Is this just a grab bag of unrelated issues, or is there some kind of thread connecting all of them? And I think a very tempting answer that's, I think, plausible is to say the left is committed to a kind of egalitarianism. We're committed to this idea that we're all equals and that our society should be built to kind of promote and respect that equality. So from that kind of fundamental commitment, we can understand why we'd be critical of capitalism, because capitalism is a kind of inegalitarian economic system. And then obviously racism, sexism, homophobia, these are all systems of oppression that create inequalities. So I think it's useful to think of the left as egalitarian, and then to think about the differences between different types of leftists in terms of the different ways that they understand this concept of egalitarianism. All right, so now what is veganism? Here is the original definition of the term that was given by Donald Watson, one of the founding members of the Vegan Society. So he says, the word veganism denotes a philosophy and way of living which seeks to exclude, as far as is possible and practical, all forms of exploitation of and cruelty to animals for food, clothing, or any other purpose, and by extension promotes the development and use of animal-free alternatives for the benefit of humans, animals, and the environment. So the thing that I want to draw our attention to in this definition is this clause, as far as possible and practical. This is important because one of the common criticisms that I hear of veganism is that it's classist and ableist, because it is said, vegans are trying to make everyone eat this strictly plant-based diet, but they don't recognize that some people, either because of their position within the class hierarchy or because of health conditions, not everyone can eat a strictly plant-based diet. Now, I don't think that really works as a criticism of the philosophy of veganism, because even in the original definition, we're already recognizing that not everyone is going to be able to eat a strictly plant-based diet. So I think what veganism is about is doing the best that you can to exclude animal products from your lifestyle. And if for some reason you are unable to completely do it all the way, you're still vegan as long as you're doing everything that you can. All right, very briefly, I also want to address this concern that there's something anti-indigenous about veganism. So, indigenous cultures, many of them have practices of hunting and consuming animals. So some people have thought, well, here are all these white vegans trying to tell everybody to, stop eating animals, but that's like forcing our Eurocentric beliefs upon indigenous communities. So I think that a concept that is useful for thinking about this issue is the concept of contextual veganism. And these are some philosophers that have written about contextual veganism, Laurie Gruen and Greta Gard. So the basic idea behind contextual veganism is this observation that really none of our moral rules or principles are entirely universal, or at least arguably so. Rather, our moral rules and principles apply in many contexts, but not all of them. So for example, consider the moral rule that you shouldn't lie. That seems like a pretty plausible moral rule. But now imagine the context in which you have invited an undocumented person to live in your home. ICE shows up at your doorstep and they say, do you know of the whereabouts of any undocumented people? In that situation, I would say, actually, you're morally required to lie, right? It's not even like just that it would be wrong to lie. You're actually morally required to lie. So moral rules depend on context. And I think in the same way, we can be vegan. We can believe that many of us in this room, for example, are living in a context where we have very strong reasons to adopt a vegan lifestyle without thinking that everyone on this planet, regardless of their context, should be living a vegan lifestyle. All right, so now I want to talk about egalitarianism and animal liberation. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that fundamental commitment of the left, and I'm going to argue that that commitment actually supports the project of animal liberation, ending the exploitation and oppression of animals for especially things like food. All right. So the way I'm going to proceed is by taking an argument that is taken from Peter Singer's book, Animal Liberation. One thing that I want to mention up front here is that Peter Singer catches a lot of heat. And I think some of that heat is justified. Especially disability activists have, I think, shown that Singer has said and written some things that are objectionably ableist. But I don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater. I think that Singer has a lot of important ideas that are worth taking seriously. And the argument from equality, which I'm going to present to you right now, is one of those ideas. So here's my basic game plan. I'm going to start by analyzing this idea of human equality that is so important for the left. Then I'm going to reflect on, what are the foundations for this human equality? What is it that makes us all a community of equals? And then I'm going to argue that the best foundations for human equality are actually going to imply that all animals are equal. So the oppression and exploitation of animals matters just as much as the oppression and exploitation of humans. All right, so let's get started. Here is a statement of human egalitarianism. This is the idea that all humans, regardless of race, sex, gender, sexuality, disability, creed, class, or community, are equal. And our question right now is, what does equal mean here? When we say that we're all equal, despite all of these differences between us, what do we mean? Now, the first thing to observe about what equal means in this statement is that equal does not mean the same. In fact, the whole point of this idea that we're all equals is that we're equal despite the great many differences between us. So I think we'd be better off thinking about equality as a kind of moral ideal. When we say that we're all equal, we're not saying we're all the same. We're saying that rather we should treat each other as equals. Now, one other clarification. I don't think that treating each other as equals means treating each other the same. And this is a point that has been made very well by disability activists. So I have here an image of a disability activist who is also a vegan. You can see that she's in a wheelchair. The caption here says the revolution is wheelchair accessible. Now, if we're going to be treating everyone the same, then we could build buildings that aren't wheelchair accessible. And we can say, well, look, we're treating everyone the same. If you want to walk in, that's great. If you're in a wheelchair, well, we're not discriminating against you because we're just treating everyone the same. But of course, when you build a building that's not wheelchair accessible, you are disrespecting the needs of people in wheelchairs. Because they're not able to walk upright, so they need different accommodations in order to be involved in our society. So what we really should be thinking when it comes to this moral ideal of equality is that we should be equally considering everyone's needs, right? So if you build a building, have a door that people can walk through, but also a ramp that a person in a wheelchair can come in through, so that we're considering everybody's needs equally. All right, so here's the original statement of human egalitarianism. And here it is rewritten based on the analysis of equality that we just did. So here's what egalitarianism says. We should equally consider the needs of all humans, regardless of race, sex, gender, sexuality, disability, creed, class, or community. Or to boil it down just even a little bit further, we shouldn't discount someone's needs just because they're different from us. All right, so we just did our analysis of human egalitarianism. And now what I want to do is ask, well, why are we all equal? What explains that? Now, a very tempting answer at this point is to say, well, we're all equal because we're all human. And this is a very common thought. As you can see, I've pulled some images here that all clearly have a kind of egalitarian message. And the words that we're using along with these images is, we are all human. So the idea here is that the basis for our equality is our shared humanity. Now that's a tempting thought, but I think at the end of the day, it's got to be wrong. So let me explain why. One way to bring out the problem here is to ask, what is special about humanity? Philosophers have said a lot of things about this. They've said, oh, it's because we have language, we have reason, we're moral agents, we can use tools, we have abstract thought. But the problem with all of these answers is that they are ableist AF, right? Because here's the thing. There's a diversity within humanity. Not all humans have language or reason or moral agency or use tools or engage in abstract thought. So if we're going to say, well, this is what makes us special, this is what makes all of us equal to each other, and animals not included in that equality, then we're saying that there are some humans that are, in a sense, aren't as human as the rest of us. They lack that thing that makes us special. So I think that we cannot justify the idea that it's humans that are equal and then the animals below us using any of these ideas because of their ableist implications. Now, another thought you might have at this point is, well, maybe we don't need to explain what's special about humanity. We can just say, look, we're equal because we're all members of the same species. Maybe the thought here is something like, well, people in the same family should take care of each other, and also members of the same species should take care of each other. But the problem with this is that this answer is very problematically arbitrary. So let me kind of flush this out a little bit. All of us in this room right now are human beings, or I think so. I don't think there's any dogs or anything in here right now. But we're also all great apes. So why do we say it's all humans that are equal as opposed to saying all great apes that are equal? And again, all of us are also mammals. So why aren't we saying, well, it's all mammals that are equal? And here's the most problematic case. I'm a white man, and there are some white men in this room. So as long as we are just allowed to arbitrarily declare the community of equals, it seems like the white men can say, well, we are the community of equals, and other folks are not included in that, right? We want to reject this kind of arbitrary drawing of the line of the community of equals. Here's another way to bring out the problem here. I call this the smart pig example. This is a thought experiment. I'm a philosopher. Please indulge me for just a moment. So imagine that we have some scientists at OSU. They're running some experiments on a pig. And they succeed in making this pig's brain grow to 4 to 5 times its natural size. So this pig is very intelligent. In fact, this pig is so smart that they start taking classes at OSU. They're studying English literature and calculus, and they go to office hours, and I don't know exactly how they're communicating, but they find a way to engage in philosophical dialogue. But now let's imagine that the scientist that helped to bring our smart pig friend into existence says, well, they're not human. I feel like eating some bacon tomorrow, so off to the slaughterhouse. We're gonna slaughter you and eat you. Now, I think most people, when they think about this example, they say, well, that is like a really awful thing to do. Because of this pig's similarities to human beings in terms of their mental faculties, it would really be wrong to slaughter them. But if that's right, that shows that the mere fact that the pig is a member of a different species does not justify excluding them from the community of equals. All right, so to wrap up now, I've argued there's nothing special about humans that places us above the animals. And I think that we should conclude from this that all humans, human and non-human, or sorry, that all animals, human and non-human, are equal. All right, so that's the argument from equality. If you have any questions about that, you want to raise any objections in the Q&A, I'd be very happy to talk about this. All right, I also want to briefly consider a criticism of the argument from equality that's made by Sonora Taylor in her great book, Beasts of Burden. I really recommend it. It explores the kind of connections between animal and disability liberation. So here's Taylor's worry. She says, Singer is relying on this comparison between humans with disabilities and non-human animals. And Taylor recognizes that the reason that Singer is drawing that comparison is actually because he wants to raise up the status of animals. But Taylor points out there is a long history of humans with disabilities being compared to animals in order to otherize them and justify their oppression. So Taylor is worried that this argument might inadvertently have some negative consequences, right? It might end up reinforcing this idea that people with disabilities are like animals. Now, I think that this is a criticism that's worth taking seriously. I hope that in my presentation of the argument today, I've managed to avoid this criticism. I think it's possible to present the argument from equality without actually explicitly drawing a comparison between humans with disabilities and non-human animals. I just said, well, look, if we're going to appeal to things like language or reason, those justifications of only considering humans to be equal have ableist implications, and that's bad. I also think that context really matters here, right? So I'm presenting, I think, to an audience of leftists that are going to be all on board with the idea that we should reject ableism. So I'm hopeful that no one is walking out of this room thinking, oh, people with disabilities are like animals, so we should be ableist. But if you want to press me on whether I have successfully avoided Taylor's worry, I would also be very happy to talk about this during the Q&A. All right, so now I want to talk about individual action and systemic harm. So there are a kind of collection of objections to veganism that all have to do with this idea that the harms of our food system are systemic in nature, and this idea that the vegan movement is all about individual action. So here is a representative example of this kind of objection to veganism. This is Naomi Klein in a Reddit Ask Me Anything, in which she is responding to someone who says, well, why don't we advocate for everyone adopting a vegan lifestyle in order to help fight climate change? And I want to say, I actually really like Naomi Klein, so I don't want to be ragging on her here. I just think she's wrong about this in particular. So here's what she says. As I've said earlier, focusing on individual consumer behavior, whether it's changing light bulbs or going vegan, is just not going to get us there. What's important is to break out of the mindset that climate change can be tackled by individual action. Those actions are important when they model change, but they do not substitute for organizing. All right. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to kind of point out a couple different ways that we can understand this objection and criticize all of the interpretations. So the most obvious way to understand what's going on here is that Naomi Klein is drawing this distinction between merely individual action and collective action. And she's saying, when we have systemic problems, individual action is inadequate. What we really need is collective action. But here's a question that I want to ask. What is collective action? So I think that people act collectively when they work together to achieve a common purpose. Here's an image of water protectors, one of the pipelines. This is an example of a collective action. People came together to prevent the further development of the pipeline, and each of them are doing their part to achieve that common purpose. So the important point to notice here is that collective action requires individuals to do their part towards achieving the common goal. So I want to make the following assertion. The vegan movement is a collective action. The vegan movement is a bunch of individuals coming together and doing their own part towards achieving a common goal of dismantling a food economy that is oppressive and exploitative to non-human animals. So I think it's just incoherent for people on the left to be saying, well, we're engaged in collective action, but the vegan movement isn't. Because I don't understand how we can define this concept in such a way that the vegan movement is not going to be a collective action. All right, now another way to understand what's going on here is to instead focus on the fact that Naomi is drawing this distinction between kind of merely consumerist behavior and political organizing. So maybe the problem is that, vegans, we're not trying to disrupt capitalism. Rather, we're just encouraging people to engage in different patterns of consumption. But this kind of effort to change the world is inferior to political organizing. But when I hear this version of the objection to veganism, I feel inclined to ask leftists, well, what do you want us to do? Do you want us to seize control of the government and ban meat? That doesn't seem like a practical path forward for us, right? We're a very small portion of the population right now. What we really need to be doing is expanding the number of vegans, and then maybe at some point we can start engaging in some efforts to win state power and enact a pro-vegan agenda. I mean, even then, I think it would be criticizable for us to, I don't know, if there's 50% of the country is vegan, then we take control of the government and we say everyone else has to be vegan now. I think that would be kind of bad. So yeah, I don't get this idea that our approach is problematic because we're not engaged in political organizing. All right, so here's one final thought that I think lies behind the worry. The worry is that your average vegan is unlikely to make a difference by themselves. And I think that's true, right? It's a big world. We're just a single individual. It is true that it's unlikely that by ourselves we're going to make a difference. And you might wonder, well, what's even the point of being vegan in that case? That's a great, interesting philosophical question. I have a whole bunch I could say about that. But instead of answering that question, I'm actually going to just point out the following. This thing that's problematic about going vegan is also true of your average individual voter or literally anyone else trying to dismantle systems of oppression. It's really unlikely that an individual voter is going to swing an election. I mean, it does sometimes happen, as Mary mentioned, right? So I would, definitely do vote, right? But it's really unlikely, especially if we're talking about something like a national presidential election, that your one vote is going to be the difference maker. And this is also true of people that are engaged in political activism. So imagine a march. Imagine a march with 1,000 people, and then one person stays home. We got a march with 999 people. Which march is what's the difference between these marches in terms of how effective that they're going to be? I think the answer is, well, they're going to be roughly the same in terms of their impact. There isn't really a difference between a march with 1,000 people and a march with 999 people. So if we're going to be reasoning consistently here, we either have to be pro trying to make the world a better place across the board, whether we're talking about adopting a vegan lifestyle, voting, or engaging in other forms of political organizing, or if we're being consistent, we could be universally apathetic, right? I don't want you to do that. I want you to believe you can make the world a better place. But what we can't do is, say one thing in the case of veganism and another in the case of other forms of, trying to make the world a better place. So Naomi, I love her. She's saying vote for Bernie. I like that message. But guess what? I don't think that my vote is going to result in Bernie being the president, right? It's incredibly unlikely that I would be the difference maker. So what's true of voting is true of adopting a vegan lifestyle. All right. So now I want to talk a little bit about how veganism fits into issues of food justice. And as I see it, there are three key issues in food justice. There's the issue of food worker exploitation. There's the issue of unjust distribution of food products. And then there's the issue of environmental injustice. So we're going to look at all three of these issues in turn. Now, the first thing that I want to mention is that vegans should be recognizing that really all of the workers in our food economy are among the most vulnerable and exploited people in the economy. So this is true of people that are growing plant-based foods. So really, I do not think that vegans should be describing our diets as cruelty-free. It doesn't involve cruelty to animals, which I think is great. But chances are, given our current capitalist economic system, even the plant-based foods that we are consuming will have caused some cruelty in their production. So we should just be honest about that. However, I also think that it's important to recognize that workers in animal agriculture, and especially in slaughterhouses, have things really bad. In fact, Oxfam currently has a campaign where they're trying to shine a light on the conditions of poultry workers here in the United States. So I've got a short video clip to describe the conditions of these poultry workers. So let's take a look at this.
Americans love chicken. Each of us eats about 89 pounds a year. We care about how these birds are raised, but how much do you know about the people who get your chicken from here to here to here? What you might not know is that the largest poultry companies, Tyson, Pilgrims, Perdue, and Sanderson Farms, make billions each year by exploiting vulnerable workers.
What Tyson does, other companies follow, even if it's to sacrifice workers' safety and health.
To increase the speed of production, companies push workers beyond their limits. Workers repeat the same motions more than 20,000 times a day, which has led to an epidemic of chronic and debilitating injuries.
Poultry workers are treated like a commodity.
People pee on themselves because the supervisors, they will not let them use the bathroom.
It is anti-human.
I needed to see a doctor, but they refused me. And I asked, can I go down to see my own orthopedics, my own doctor? And they said, if you do that, we're gonna fire you.
Who are these companies? They're among America's favorite brands. 4 companies control nearly 60% of U.S. chicken production. A worker processes 30 or more chickens each minute, 1 every 2 seconds, nearly 2,000 chickens an hour, over 14,000 chickens in a workday.
At Perdue, we pride ourselves on the freshness of our chicken.
Every time I laugh at the commercial because they say, we are taking care of our chicken, but they are not taking care of their worker.
So in addition to the kind of physical risks of working at a slaughterhouse, as they said in the video, those poultry plant workers are making the same cut 20,000 times a day, right? So I don't know about you, but if I spend a lot of my time in the day working on my laptop, my wrists kind of start to hurt a little bit. So I can really only imagine what making the same cut 20,000 times in a chicken would feel like. But in addition to the physical risks of those jobs, there's also the issue of slaughterhouse workers and their risk for developing symptoms of PTSD. So the DSM-5, this is the manual that mental health professionals use to diagnose individuals with mental health conditions, recognizes participation in violence as a potential risk factor for the development of PTSD. So the DSM-5, in a passage in which they're describing potential risk factors, they write, for military personnel, being a perpetrator, witnessing atrocities, or killing the enemy. So, you know, the psychological community is already in agreement that it's not just being a victim of violence that can be a traumatic stressor. It's also being a perpetrator of violence or even just a witness to violence that can cause symptoms of traumatic stress. And in fact, some psychologists and sociologists have argued that we really should have a separate word for this type of traumatic stress. So they call it perpetration-induced traumatic stress, or PITS. Now, if people can be traumatized by committing acts of violence against other humans, it really stands to reason that the same could happen when you are committing acts of violence against animals, especially when you're a slaughterhouse worker and killing hundreds or thousands of animals a day. So unfortunately, there has not been a lot of research on this issue yet, but there is significant anecdotal evidence that there are people in slaughterhouses that are being traumatized by their work. So I have here an image of Virgil Butler. He has an incredible story. I would encourage you to go check him out online. He worked in a poultry plant for like 20 years. And then at a certain point, he had a breaking point. He could no longer do it. And he started engaging in animal rights activism and kind of sharing his experiences as a slaughterhouse worker with the general public. So here's a quotation from Virgil Butler describing his experience. He says, "The sheer amount of killing and blood can really get to you after a while, especially if you can't just shut down all emotion and turn into a robot zombie of death. You feel like part of a big death machine. You're pretty much treated that way as well. Sometimes weird thoughts will enter your head. It's just you and the dying chickens. The surreal feelings grow into such a horror of the barbaric nature of your behavior. You are murdering helpless birds by the thousands, 75,000 to 90,000 a night. You are a killer." Here's one more quotation, this one from another slaughterhouse worker, Ed Van Winkle. He writes, "The worst thing, worse than the physical danger, is the emotional toll. Pigs down on the kill floor have come up and nuzzled me like a puppy. 2 minutes later, I had to kill them, beat them to death with a pipe. So here's the point I want to end on when it comes to worker exploitation. Yes, all workers in the food economy are exploited, and we should be working to end that exploitation. But there is a particular kind of harm that we are visiting upon slaughterhouse workers that is just completely unnecessary. Imagine an ideal world. Ask yourself, in that ideal world, are we going to be paying anyone to be killing animals all day long so that we can eat those animals? I think the answer to that question is no. All right, now I want to talk about another issue in food justice you've probably heard of. This is the issue of so-called food deserts. Now, personally, I think that term is a bit of a misnomer because it seems to imply that the fact that some communities don't have access to healthy foods is a kind of accident of geography as opposed to being caused by our social policies. But just sticking with the kind of terminology that is out there, the point that I want to make is that the issue of food deserts is something that the left and the vegan movement can obviously collaborate on, right? The left is interested in making sure that communities have access to healthy food, and the primary way in which we can, improve communities' access to healthy food is by giving them fresh fruits and vegetables. So this is a place where the left and veganism clearly point in the same direction. There's also the issue of hunger. So right now, we are producing more than enough food to feed everyone on the planet. And yet, according to the World Food Program, which is part of the United Nations, 821 million people, that's more than 1 in 9, are not getting enough to eat. And it turns out that this issue of food justice is actually connected to some issues with animal agriculture. So these two issues are connected because raising livestock to feed people is an incredibly inefficient and wasteful way to feed them. Because in order to raise an animal, you need to feed them a bunch of food. And the primary way in which we feed them food is by growing crops that could be fed to humans. And if you look at those crops that we're feeding to the animals, you could feed way more people with those crops than you can feed with the meat, dairy, and eggs that we get from the animals. So here's a graph that I took from creating a sustainable food future. This was put out by the World Bank in the United Nations. So this shows us the percentage of calories and grams of protein that we get from animals compared to how many calories and grams of protein we fed them. So look at beef. We get back 1% of the calories in the form of beef that we feed to a cow. So this means that when you eat a beef burger, it is as if you are throwing away 99 plant-based burgers with the same number of calories. And with beef, we're only getting back 4% of the protein. So we're living in a world in which we're using our food resources, funneling them through some animals in order to feed a rich elite, while a great number of people are hungry. All right, now I want to just briefly touch on the issue of environmental injustice. So 99% of the animal products that are consumed are coming from factory farms, also known as CAFOs, concentrated animal feeding operations. And these factory farms have enormous numbers of animals on them, thousands, millions. And because we have all of these animals packed into one space, you also end up with an enormous amount of waste. And this is an environmental injustice issue because that waste ends up in the water, in the air of the communities that these farms are located in. And predictably, these farms are located in communities that are vulnerable and that don't have the resources to fight back, right? These are not being located in affluent white neighborhoods. There's about 10 times the number of CAFOs in North Carolina in low-income and black and brown communities compared to the contrast class. Finally, there's also the issue of animal agriculture and its relationship to climate change. So according to conservative studies put out by the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, livestock production is responsible for about 14.5% of greenhouse gas emissions. So this is more than all of the emissions that are produced by the transportation sector, cars, buses, trucks, etc. So really, any realistic plan to confront the climate crisis is going to have to contain a transition towards plant-based diets as a component. And climate change is also obviously a kind of global justice issue because the climate crisis is primarily created by the activities of the rich nations, but the nations that are going to be suffering the most because of climate change are the poor nations. All right. If you're interested in learning more about how veganism fits into these issues about food justice, there are some great organizations out there. Food Empowerment Project, A Well-Fed World, and then there's this classic book, Diet for a Small Planet. If you're interested in that, I would get the 20th anniversary edition. All of this will be up online if you're interested in checking this stuff out. All right, so I just spent a whole bunch of time saying the left-wing critics get us wrong, but now it's time to finally give them their due. All right, so first of all, left-wing critics are right to point out that veganism is not enough. And that's for many reasons, but here's one of them. The apparent environmental and food justice benefits of vegan diets may not materialize if we don't address the underlying problems of capitalism. So let me explain what I mean with the example of rainforest deforestation. So some of you may know that animal agriculture is overwhelmingly the cause of rainforest deforestation. It's estimated between like 80 to 90% of rainforest deforestation is caused by the need to either have land to grow cattle on or to grow crops to feed to cattle. So you might think, well, look, if we go vegan tomorrow, 90% of rainforest deforestation will end. But here's the problem. If livestock companies stop buying rainforest land, that means that the demand for a commodity is going down. And when the demand for a commodity in a market goes down, so does the price for the commodity. So this means that if we all went vegan tomorrow, the price for rainforest land would fall greatly. And there are other industries that like buying cheap land and producing their products on it. So it's possible that other industries would just end up buying the newly cheap land in order to produce things like rubber and so forth. So the full environmental and food justice benefits are not going to be found, unless we both have a transition towards vegan diets and address the underlying problems of capitalism. This point is also especially true of hunger, right? The reason people don't get fed is because they don't have money. You can't make money feeding people that don't have any money. So if we go vegan tomorrow, we'll have a lot more resources to feed the world with, but unless we make some changes to the systems that we're using to distribute those resources, there are still going to be hungry people. All right, so left-wing critics are also right to point out that focusing on personal purity instead of the bigger systemic picture is a mistake. So there are lots of examples that we could talk about here. One you might have heard of recently, this kind of attention-grabbing headline. A vegan man is suing Burger King because its Impossible Whopper is cooked on the same broiler as meat, right? So if we're thinking big picture, systemic, what the vegan movement wants is to increase the accessibility of plant-based foods. But if we're creating a situation where any company that is currently selling animal-based foods has to kind of worry to themselves, well, if we start selling some plant-based foods, are the vegans going to come for us, right? That is actually harming the goal of the vegan movement. So this is just one example of a case where a focus on personal purity is really kind of inconsistent with thinking in a kind of systemic way. All right. Left-wing critics are also right to point out that vegans should recognize that not everyone can eat a strictly plant-based diet. So I kind of pointed out earlier that it's false that the philosophy of veganism is ableist or classist, but that criticism can still hold true of vegan activists that go around saying everyone can eat a strictly plant-based diet. That's just not true. There are people with eating disorders. There are people with different health conditions. If you have enough food allergies, it really can be very difficult to eat a plant-based diet. So I don't think that the vegan movement should be going around saying everyone needs to eat completely, strictly plant-based. What we should say is, look, embrace this philosophy of veganism, and as a vegan, be doing everything that you can to exclude animal products from your life. All right, finally, left-wing critics are right to point out that vegans should do a better job of addressing racism, sexism, and other isms in the movement. This could be the topic of a whole other presentation, so I'm not going to be diving too much further into it, but I anticipate that we are going to have programming in the future just kind of focusing on the ways in which vegan activists have used messaging that contains racist or sexist tropes. All right, so almost there. We're about to finish. I want to conclude by noting an opportunity and challenge, both for vegans and then for the left. So beginning first with the vegans, I'm speaking to all of you vegans in the room. The left shares many of our principles, and there are lots of issues on which we could work together with them. So the left could be our allies, but solidarity is a two-way street. If we want them to show up for us, we need to show up for them. So this means we need to break out of this mindset that we need to be single-issue activists, focused only on animals. We're not betraying the cause if we broaden our scope and are engaged in multiple struggles at once. That, in fact, is what we need to do to develop these relationships with other movements, and that, in the long run, is actually going to be good for our movement. Now, I want to address one thing in particular that the vegan movement needs to do in order to develop these relationships of solidarity with other social justice movements. So vegans have this thing they do where they instrumentalize other struggles for our own purposes. So here's what I mean. Vegans like to say, oh, we love anti-racism, we love Martin Luther King, but we love it because we can make it about animals, right? We're not there for those movements when it comes to actually doing the work of contributing to those struggles. So I have here some examples of this kind of problem. This is a recent post that Million Dollar Vegan made on Martin Luther King Day. Thankfully, they took it down. But first of all, we have this problem that Million Dollar Vegan is not engaged in any anti-racist stuff. So here we are on Martin Luther King Day. It's supposed to be about him and his legacy. MLK didn't really have animals on his radar. Why is Million Dollar Vegan trying to make this about the animals? But even worse, they're attributing to MLK a quote that he never said. And this is really easy to find out. You literally just Google it, and you're like, oh yeah, he didn't say this. So on the one hand, the vegans are trying to say, yeah, we love Martin Luther King, but we don't love him enough to get the facts straight, and we only love him because we can make him about the animals. OK, I also have two examples here from PETA. One thing that I want to say is that, although I'm critical of some things that PETA does, I'm not a complete PETA basher. I think they do some good things, some bad things. But we're here to talk about the bad. Here's a billboard they had. Face it, you can't claim to be a feminist and still eat eggs, right? The problem, of course, is that PETA is not a feminist organization. They don't do anti-sexist work. They only care about feminism when they can make it about the animals. And here's a recent example. You might have heard about this. PETA had this ad that they wanted to run during the Super Bowl in which they had animals taking a knee to end speciesism in a clear allusion to Colin Kaepernick. So again, it seems like PETA is trying to say, yeah, we're all about this social justice stuff. Yay, Colin Kaepernick. But they only care about it because they can make it about the animals. They're not actually contributing, to the struggle against racist police violence. So vegans, don't do that, please. All right. Concluding now with an opportunity and challenge for leftists. So speaking now to the leftists in the room, In the next decade, the accessibility of vegan food is going to skyrocket, like real soon. And this will lead to a huge increase in the number of vegans. It's kind of easier to be vegan when the food is very accessible. These new vegans will be primed to be receptive to left messaging. And let me explain why I think that is. You know, when someone adopts veganism, they're like, oh my God, my world is blown. All this stuff that I took for granted turns out was false. So when you first kind of adopt veganism, your thinking is fresh. You're thinking critically. You're asking yourselves, what else have I been wrong about? So they're kind of ready for critical engagement. Moreover, it shouldn't be hard for the left to come to the great number of vegans that are about to emerge, I hope, and say, look, there's this very clear connection between capitalism and the exploitation of animals, right? The reason that we have such incredibly gratuitous factory farming is because that's how you make a profit, right? And that's capitalism. So these vegans are going to be ready to hear messaging from the left, but those vegans are going to be less likely to be radicalized by the left if the left dismisses their cause, or even worse, tries to act like their project is inconsistent with leftist principles. So look, the left, there's a new movement that's about to really pick up speed, get off the ground. We can be allies, but you just got to stop acting like our projects are inconsistent with each other. All right, I made it all the way through. Thank you, all of you guys. I'd like to conclude by saying the left and veganism, we're stronger together. All right, thanks. All right, so shall we take a Q&A now? For how long? How much time? What? Oh, I didn't start the timer.
Okay, let's do maybe 10 minutes.
10 minutes? OK. Yeah, I saw EA's hand raised.
Oh, he has hand raised.
OK, Keith?
Yeah, so you mentioned ableism. I wonder how you would define ableism, because there's going to be discrimination based on disability or ability, most likely for a long time. For instance, we're not going to most likely have a dwarf play in the Super Bowl, or we're not going to hire someone with dementia to teach at the Ohio State University. So how would you define it?
So the question is about how we define ableism. I think it's an interesting philosophical question. I think we could distinguish between at least two different types of ableism. So on an individual level, it seems it's ableist if you say, well, because someone has some disability, their needs matter less than other people. And then there's a kind of more systemic analysis of ableism, where we say, well, look at our society, right? Our society is set up such that some people can flourish and some people can't, right? This is true, for example, when it comes to racism, sexism, but also to the issue of disability, right? So I think that on a societal level, we should be doing everything that we can to make sure that the great diversity of humanity all has an opportunity to flourish. So yeah, I mean, that world is in the future, but we're working to get there. All right, thank you. Yeah, EA?
Okay, so you brought up the example of McDonald's offering, or you brought the example of food injustice and food insecurity, and then you have the Burger King Impossible Whopper, and the example with the gentleman saying that he was concerned about his own personal purity, and then he sues Burger King. So we already know that these fast food companies, they are very interested in capitalism and perpetuating that system, but at the same time, they are capitalizing on the vegan movement to include our products, but at the same time, they're marginalizing the communities they exist in. So as vegans, I'm of the perspective that if we have more privilege, we should not be supporting them if we have other food alternatives. But other vegans are also saying that if we don't support them, they will not continue the vegan food options, and then people experiencing food insecurity may not have any other vegan food options.
Yeah, so that is a great, interesting question. So the way that I would think about this, not everyone has to think the same way, but the way I would think about this is, what is actually going to result in a world where vegan food is accessible to as many people as possible, right? That's the world that I want. Because honestly, I think that once vegan food is just as delicious and just as accessible as non-vegan food, I think a huge number of the population is going to start eating plant-based diets. So that's my goal. And then the question is, what will actually bring about that goal? I'm inclined to think that buying like the new vegan foods, like, I don't know, plant-based chicken, plant-based burgers, is important for achieving that goal because we want to create enough demand for them to expand production and achieve economies of scale. So I am inclined to think that we do have good reasons to be purchasing those foods. I mean, I also think that we have good reasons to be supporting like local vegan businesses. I think that's very important as well. So that's how I would think about it. But I don't know, maybe we should talk more about this afterwards. I would be interested to speak with you about the CA. Cool. In the back, yeah.
My question is, like, I'm going to push back a little bit and be devil advocate.
Yes, good.
So in terms of my minority neighborhoods, how do you plan on educating, or do you have a mindset or ideas on how to educate lower class communities that are at risk for food insecurity? Because like recently, for example, Jay-Z came out and said, oh, he's a vegan, and he went on the radio and made a bunch of speeches, and he got a huge backlash because African Americans in their communities are concerned about being pushed out of their neighborhoods through gentrification.
Mm-hmm.
We have much bigger fish to fry,
Right.
and we're concerned about housing,
Right.
schools, education, stuff like that. And so how would you have an ideal of like educating those type of communities about, because it would be great, because then that would mean we would have lesser health issues.
Right.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
But to push back a little bit, it's like, you know, throughout the whole country, there's gentrification going on.
Yeah.
You know, the
Yeah.
inner city now is the area to move in. I mean, my neighborhood has done like a 180.
Right.
You know, so you see us being pushed out of our neighborhoods, and now you got Trump who wants to, you know, take away food stamps, stuff like that. So it's like, okay, now you want to take away just our basic nourishment. You know what I'm saying? So
Yeah,
it's like,
good. So I think you actually are raising two good questions. So one of those questions is kind of something like, well, isn't this issue of so-called food deserts really a bit more complicated, right? We don't just need to make fresh fruits and vegetables available in those communities. We're also going to need to provide education for those communities. I mean, at least just because they're like not used to cooking with those foods, and you know, learning to cook new foods takes time and energy, and you know, those people might not have a lot of time and energy. And I think you're absolutely right about that, right? Like, we need to be asking ourselves, how are we not only going to make those foods accessible, but also how are we going to educate people so that they are equipped to take advantage of those new opportunities? I think that is going to require, you know, maybe political organizing, local groups working on that issue. Maybe we could also have some programs connected to the state. Do you have a suggestion?
So we have some information about Food Not Bombs. I think we're already working a little bit in that space, and then Plant the Power, I think, is working a little bit in this space as well.
Yeah.
Just as there's probably other resources as well, but just there are a couple of organizations starting to go into that space, but there's so much more work that absolutely has to be done.
Yeah, good. And I think your other question is just like, how is this message going to be receptive in communities where people feel like we already got enough stuff that we're dealing with? We don't need to worry about this stuff. And yeah, I mean, I don't think that vegans should be going into those communities and saying, you know, shame on you for not being worried about our issues, right? I think that we should do everything that we can to expand the accessibility of plant-based foods. And I think that we should try to build relationships with those communities, those kind of relationships of solidarity. And if they're not in a place where they're ready to think about our issues, we'll go somewhere else. There's lots of people that I think are ready to be worried about these issues. Cool. Thank you. Okay, yes, Seth?
So, first of all, thank you so much for your talk. I especially was struck by the call that veganism is collective action, which somehow I hadn't thought about before, but I appreciate that. I want to go back to one of the things you said that I struggle with philosophically to kind of understand, which is that you said that, that it's arbitrary in a sense to say, well, it's humans that are the category that we're going to be in solidarity with. Why not primates? Why not, people living in Ohio? Like, we could draw the line anywhere. And so you're suggesting we expand to include all animals. And then right away I'm thinking, well, the criticism is, well, that's arbitrary too. Why animals and not something else? Why not vertebrates? And excluding some animals, or why not including other species beyond animals? So, like I said, I'm not sure how I would answer that question, but I'm thinking of that criticism, so I thought I'd throw it out to you.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so I thought a lot about this. So I think drawing the line between beings that have consciousness and can experience pain and pleasure strikes me as less arbitrary than drawing the line elsewhere, right? So if there are some beings that they don't have anything going on inside of them, right? They don't feel pain, they don't feel pleasure. It seems like we can't really harm them, I would think, in that case. Now, there is this kind of further question. Are there plants, for example, that have consciousness, right? Seems like maybe kind of funky, but also, like, who knows? Consciousness is strange. We don't really understand consciousness. So I actually think like if plants have consciousness, we should be worried about them too. But sometimes people kind of bring this up as an objection to veganism. Like, why don't you care about the plants? And I don't think that works because, yes, we're going to have to eat something. And are we really harming plants when we give them a place to grow and then we eventually harvest them and consume them, right? Like, I think, what does a plant want? It wants a field that it can grow in. That's something that we can provide to them. Now, when it comes to animals, if we want to be feeding people the number of animal products that we're consuming, we're basically going to have to take animals and put them in incredibly confined cages and I think basically torture them over their entire lives. So I think feeding ourselves with animals requires us to essentially torture them. And I don't think that if we're feeding each other with plants, even if they're conscious, that we're actually torturing them.
And we're feeding the plants.
And we're feeding the plants. Yeah, we're giving them some soil to grow in and enjoy life. Yeah.
One more question, and then we'll break, and then do Q&A.
All right, cool. Yes.
So, and frankly, this is less question than comment, but thinking about your statement, the conversation about individualism and organizing, and particularly since you brought Kropotkin in and anarchism. So, for many people, organizing looks like there being an organization and joining in solidarity and groups. But organizing is also about 3 or 4 people coming together and doing whatever small thing it is that they need done.
Right.
And in regard to, I think particularly with the issue of gentrification, I think a lot about, like MOVE or the Black Panther movement, where a lot of that was more just about, setting up community dinners, setting up, within neighborhood healthcare clinics, things like that, and not even like, okay, we need to, build a soup kitchen. Just we need to invite some neighbors together and share a meal. And in just doing those little things, you are organizing and you are building a community that starts to know one another and trust one another. And, then if you want to get fully radical, you can, start kicking the landlords out of your block and prevent the police from coming into your your neighborhood and all of that. But obviously you have to start somewhere. And, you know, I mean, sharing a meal with neighbors, and, you know, as someone who earlier in life was very much a carnivore, I can tell you, it is a significant change to go from eating meat to eating tofu and things like that. I mean, it really, it's not something that as vegans should be minimized when you're talking to people who haven't made that change yet, because you know, it's a big leap. So think about it in terms of just starting very small and you know, just inviting neighbors in, things like that.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree, right? So there's organizing to change the big system that we live in, and then there's also organizing to kind of create our own networks to support and care for each other. And even if we don't yet have the organization to change the whole big system, we can at least build those smaller networks to help each other out. So yeah, that sounds great to me. All right, thank you. I guess I'm done doing the Q&A. Frank, what are you doing now?
I just want to say I am in awe of your mental acuity.
Oh, thank you, Frank. Thank you, Frank.